Good morning. We're live, Mark. We are live again.
We are just...
Well, we are live, whether we are alive.
well, perhaps we should devote this episode of The Impact Narrative to discussing that philosophical
Those
issue.
Existential issues.
Well, it might be more productive and cheerful than talking about the news.
Oh, probably, given what we've got on our agenda today on this week's episode of The Impact Narrative.
Yeah, so it's cheer and goodwill all the way, really. And
Christmas cheer, Christmas spirit.
Exactly, and so you know the origins of the Christian myth obviously are very much linked to what is currently the state of Israel.
And planetary bar humbug, I think, we're dealing with this week.
Okay, well, do you want to discuss that? Because that seems to be the big issue of the day, President Trump's latest initiative.
Well, yeah, I think it is. As you say, it's front page of the BBC. Headline news: President Donald Trump has decided that he wants to move the US Embassy, which has historically been in Tel Aviv, a Mediterranean city on the west coast of Israel, to Jerusalem, to recognise Israel's capital as Jerusalem. Now, this is hugely contested, hugely problematic, Mark, for a range of different reasons. And we could spend a week talking about the issues that are involved here. We could trace it back all the way to, well, take your pick.
Biblical times, maybe.
One might say biblical times, the Crusades, take your pick. I mean, it's huge amounts of history at play here. But I think that for the purposes of brevity and trying to keep things short and snappy today, we've got a lot of other things to talk about. I think we need to just go back to the formation of the State of Israel, 1948, and that legacy of colonial times, the legacy of colonial occupation across the Middle East, legacy of British involvement, something that we talk about in our book, actually.
I think we do. Oh, we don't have the book. We don't have any book. We'll have to just pluck one randomly from your shelves and say it's our book of the week.
Oh, we can certainly do that. But no, I think this is a huge step by Trump. The US has typically avoided getting embroiled into this aspect of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, this aspect of the Israeli-Arab conflict, and has tried to stay kind of on the periphery with regard to what would be recognised as the State of Israel's capital, and has kept its embassy there in Tel Aviv, kind of a little bit removed from the real centre of, the epicentre, I guess, if you will, of this struggle. I think it's important to just flag up a couple of things. So at play we have the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is a conflict over land, over identities, over the rights to citizenship, membership, sovereignty, if you will, and it's a struggle that goes back decades. In this particular format,
centuries.
We've been talking about post-1948. But then you also have the broader Israeli-Arab struggle, which draws in a number of the neighbouring Arab states, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, etc., that have been historically at war with Israel in support of the Palestinian cause. Now, that later dimension has, over the past decade or so, been largely forgotten, largely ignored by Arab leaders who had their own domestic agendas at play. So they've largely ignored this issue, leaving it to be settled between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Now, Jerusalem is seen to be the capital of both Israel and a future Palestinian state. Both sides of this conflict lay claim to Jerusalem as the epicenter, as their eternal capital. Now, it's central to a number of different people, not only the Israelis and the Palestinians, but also Christians, Jews, Muslims. It's the holiest site in Christianity, Church of the Holy Sepulchre, allegedly where Christ was crucified and buried. It's the third holiest site in Islam, the Dome of the Rock, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, where Muhammad took his night journey, and it's the holiest site in Judaism, the Western Wall, the last remaining part of the Second Temple. And so, because it's so contested, it's so important, the diplomatic community has traditionally avoided putting embassies there, recognising it as the capital of one or the other. Tried to sort of ignore that part of a broader, intractable conflict. And so for Trump to go against decades of diplomatic protocol, to go against decades of international norms of saying we will not officially, formally recognise Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, even so the Israelis are having it as their de facto capital, and Palestinians refer to it as their eternal capital of the future Palestinian state. this is going to really set the cat loose amongst the pigeons here, because what it will do, I think, is not only escalate tensions between the Israelis and the Palestinians, but also draw back the Arab populations that had long been sort of on the periphery of this conflict. As I was mentioning, the Arab populations of Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, who had largely been focused on their own domestic affairs. But while rulers of these states have in recent times become to engage in more of a rapprochement with Israel, particularly when considering the perceived threat by Iran, the populations of those states have long retained this real suspicion and dislike for Israel. So what it could also do is lead to a serious fracture between rulers and their populations. So,
which obviously is kind of an ongoing story anyway.
Well, it is, yeah. But what Haaretz is reporting, this is a left-wing Israeli newspaper, is that Palestinians have called for 3 days of rage across the Arab world in protest against this move. So I think it's it's really going to ignite a whole range of protests and reignite a whole range of different issues as well. Now, we've not seen those protests as yet, but I think that we will see a range of different declarations of agency.
Yeah, I mean, one thing about it is that he's declared the intention to move the embassy there, but there's no date fixed, I don't think. It's just kind of, it's going to happen. And so it's a bit difficult to have a day of rage against a declaration, but it's more the case, I guess, that the focus for the rage would be when the embassy opens its doors.
Or to prevent the move from happening. To try and say, if you do this, then this is the implication for, this is the anger, the outpouring of anger right now at your decision to do this.
Yeah, except that Mr. Trump obviously knew there would be that outpouring of anger,
Of course,
and in fact, almost certainly this is mainly to do with deflecting attention from his own problems, it would seem to me.
Of course, I tweeted this morning that I wondered if he'd been given a steer from some of the other Middle Eastern leaders. I wonder if there's been some kind of dialogue between him and
that's a conspiracy theory.
Perhaps it is, but Mohammed bin Salman, who's been leading this burgeoning rapprochement between the Israelis and the Saudis.
Right.
So I wonder if there's been a bit of a nod and a wink given by someone. This is just my speculation, of course. But I wonder if that's happened, because he can't be that naive to think that this kind of thing can happen without repercussions.
Well, yeah, but the repercussions won't be for America.
No,
because in the end, the American allies in the area would probably prefer that America wasn't such a dominant force. So they're kind of playing ball with America because they have to, it would seem to me. Not because they love America, but because America has got the power to support them in whatever they're wanting.
That's certainly true.
To
but for Egypt gets billions of dollars in aid each year from the US. But also Israel gets money in aid, but it also gets that financial the financial support, the military support, but also that huge diplomatic support in the UN.
Oh yeah, but the people who are annoyed about this already have feelings. It's not going to make their feelings much more. I mean, I get the thing is that obviously the two-state solution that even people like George Bush talked about has hardly progressed very far. So I think leaders of the area know by now that America isn't really going to help to solve the problem in a constructive way. So all this is doing is confirming in spectacular and completely ham-fisted and deliberately provocative fashion, and I guess he's just saying, make my day. Is that right?
Quite possibly. But I think
that's what he tends to do.
Well, he does. I think it's particularly odd, though, given that the Israelis, the Israeli leadership, I should say, anyway, have been speaking quite openly about wanting to move toward a two-state solution, but not necessarily doing anything to bring it about. So it's a lot of...
Well, that's what the Americans have been doing as well, isn't it?
Exactly, but this will have a serious impact on the ability to have that two-state solution, I would imagine. This would destroy any level of trust that can be seen toward the Americans, but also I just think they will have a serious impact on Palestinians and how they will feel about the international community. There's already a great deal of suspicion toward the Americans, but how they will view this situation now is just a complete rejection of their of their values, of their norms, of their political rights.
Yeah, well, we'll see. I mean, as I say, it seems to me that this issue has been in logjam for so long, and even Tony Blair couldn't sort it out.
Well, if
that's
Blair
how difficult.
couldn't do it, then.
You know, so again, it's just like turning up the heat in a kitchen which was already pretty unpleasant to live in.
Yeah, I mean, let's not forget that Oslo was 25 years ago.
Yeah.
25 years of so-called peace. Peace in a very narrow sense of the word, in the sense that there is an absence of war between the Israelis and the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization.
Yeah.
So, I think it's a worrying time. Very worrying.
That's a Freudian slip there. You said the Palestinian Liberalisation Organisation.
I did, yeah. Well, of course, I meant Liberation Organisation.
Yeah, I just thought I'd pull you up on that to make up for
your
any
stomach rumbling
for my
last
stomach
week.
rumbling last week, which was you know a kind of a Freudian slip of a different kind. Anyway,
Well, it's something we all enjoyed anyway. There were some comments beneath the video about it, actually.
Really?
They said, we want to hear more of Mark's stomach.
Excellent. Well,
Certainly,
I'm
more
having
wisdom than Simon gave him.
Yeah, well, I'm having my cup of coffee on an empty stomach just
Excellent.
to build up to that moment.
So we'll mic you up next week then.
So again, you know, it's obviously a story. It's another sign that the American diplomacy of days gone by, is very much the thing of days gone by.
It certainly is, yeah.
And this isn't diplomacy. The word diplomacy is being stretched beyond normal limits when you call that diplomacy.
I think so, yeah. And I think we saw a different type of diplomacy taking place as well between the UK and the US in this past week with regard to Twitter diplomacy.
Right,
So obviously I'm getting at this idea of President Trump. I can't speak today. Take that in
Yeah.
President
Have some coffee
Trump
instead of water.
retweeting a
Yes, it seems
first.
again the news agenda just goes so quickly, doesn't it? But of course the thing about Palestine, Boris Johnson has said something like this is very unhelpful or whatever, which is again when the British say that about something the Americans have done, then it obviously is something they're extremely displeased about.
Obviously.
But yeah, that little spat, which you know does seem to have just gone into the ether. Like all Twitter things do, I guess.
140 characters, no more.
But
Which is actually a clever thing to say twice over.
But yeah, I mean it's been eclipsed rather a lot by Brexit. But if we had been talking about, it must have happened late last week, was it?
I think so. After we
so it
recorded
missed
last
our.
week,
Usually they try to hit our deadlines to make sure we talk about the big themes of the week.
Like the cricket.
The cricket, but you don't want to talk about that.
No, I'm very sad about it. Very disappointed. But you are.
Well, there was a survey. I think there was a survey on the aforementioned BBC where people were guessing what was going to happen, and it was something like 1% said that there would be a valiant last wicket stand and we would just scrape home, and I think about 2% said we would win quite easily. And it was certainly well over 93%. It was 93%, well over 90% who said that there would be a terrible collapse.
Well, I was certainly in that 90% or 93% or whatever it was. But that still doesn't mean that I'm not disappointed. It's the hope that kills you, Mark.
It is, yeah, well then...
As an Arsenal fan, I'm used to this.
Yeah.
Gallant failure. But anyway...
right, so that's the cricket dealt with.
That's the cricket dealt with, so we can use that hashtag now.
Yeah, so the Theresa May thing, yeah, I mean, in a way, well, is it helpful or not? This is another thing that could be kicked into the long grass. They could be still debating the date of a state visit. I'm sure that really the preferred date will be sometime after the next presidential election, when they hope that it'll be Michelle Obama and or whoever, George Clooney,
Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson.
There's every possibility. I've never heard of that person, but
right.
Kano West or somebody. Isn't there somebody called that? Anyway,
yes.
So
yes, there is.
So but no, it probably isn't, because I probably mispronounced his name. But,
yes, you have.
Yes. So that's rather been taken over by the Brexit disaster. And
so what's the latest Brexit disaster, Mark?
Well, the latest disaster. Well, there's so many chickens coming home to roost for Mrs May, and certainly the general election is now, you could probably consider that to be the most ill-advised gamble taken by a British Prime Minister since Suez, probably, for 60 years. And the first thing, obviously, it draws attention to this crazy alliance between the DUP and the Conservative Party. And the DUP, they just seem to be, the Conservatives are going on about being a unionist party, whatever. The people that they were in alliance with were very much more civilised and in the way they discussed things than the DUP. In other words, they had an alliance with the Ulster Unionist Party, who believed, reluctantly, but believed in the idea of compromise. The DUP are really very like President Trump in many respects, but I suppose they're more predictable than President Trump.
Right.
And what's happening here, I don't know really, because the logic of what they're trying to do, they obviously, the main point is they don't like the deal that Mrs May was on the verge of agreeing with the EU Commission, because it implied that there'd be a difference between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK in terms of its relation with the EU, but that relations would essentially be unchanged with the rest of Ireland. So you could see this as being a big step towards the creation of a united Ireland.
So Mark, just before we go any further with this, what does this stem from then? What part of the EU deal does that stem from?
Well, the problem is that the Brexit vote, which of course Northern Ireland wanted to remain, although the vote was not quite as clear-cut as in Scotland or London, but even so, Northern Ireland population preferred to remain. As much as anything, people in the Protestant community wanted to keep this, because otherwise you're going to get a border between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland, which would effectively be a land border between Britain and the EU, and this threatened to recreate the situation which the Good Friday Agreement of 1997 had supposedly resolved, and a hard border where there'd be checks of a very intrusive nature, and that would threaten, although I'm not really sure that it would have this effect, because the appetite for armed struggle is so low in Northern Ireland. But at least theoretically you could say it could recreate the ugly scenes of the 70s, 80s and 90s.
Well, certainly amplify those, and having that securitized nature of a border will amplify and exacerbate existing tensions, those latent economic and community divisions that are still remaining, even though the armed dimension has been stripped from it.
Yeah, and as much as anything, although the trade relations perhaps aren't as significant as people would suppose, but they still are significant. Northern Ireland's real underlying problem is social deprivation, and to the extent that that's likely to be accentuated by Brexit anyway, that is the kind of fuel which could easily lead to a new bout of sectarian violence. So. And it's so humiliating. The thing is, we're now so used to the British Prime Minister being humiliated that it's kind of par for the course, really. But to be on the verge of an agreement with the EU and then calling Arlene Foster the DUP and being told that the deal is off, it is, the idea that the Leavers thought that, and of course this programme, this show, this vlog,
here comes the weekly caveat,
doesn't have any views at all on Brexit, but
we are politically neutral.
Many of those who voted for Leave did so on the understanding that this would be a liberationist gesture to basically restore Britain's greatness. Well, it's not a particularly good start on the path towards the restoring of Britain's greatness. The idea that the British Prime Minister is in hock to 10 MPs of a party who are divisive within Northern Ireland, let alone, most people in the rest of Britain haven't heard of them, but if they have heard of them, they tend to look at their views on things like gender and abortion, etc., and find them slightly out of sync with the rest of Britain. So a party which is right-wing, even by the standards of but is equally right-wing as the Conservative Party is now, is basically in control of the most important policy facing Britain at the moment.
Which is quite a terrifying thought, and not particularly in any way about reclaiming our sovereignty or taking back control, as you say. So, just before we go into this a little bit deeper, Mark, and I think we need to, I think it's worth just giving people just a whistle-stop 60-second overview of the DUP.
Right, well, the DUP,
okay,
the origin...
I'll get a clock out.
The origins of the DUP The DUP really is a product of the unrest. The Ulster Unionist Party was the establishment party which supported the Union and was, 99.9% Protestant, and was generally quite gentrified and full of people who did fit with the Conservative Party, apart from the one issue on which they were fairly immovable, which is the sanctity of the Union. The DUP was a much more vociferous and radical version of the same thing, and you can see where it's born from. It's born from a feeling that the Ulster Unionists couldn't be trusted to stand up vigorously enough for the ascendancy of Protestantism in Northern Ireland, and of course its first leader and its kind of inspiration was the Reverend Ian Paisley, a great orator, but not somebody who was kind of a much more interesting and rounded version of Donald Trump in many respects. Certainly not somebody who believed in diplomacy. And over time, ironically, because of the peace agreement, people, even moderate Protestants, have found it safe to vote for the DUP rather than the old Ulster Unionists, because they are seen as the group which will speak up most loudly in a violent situation. It was kind of not respectable to vote for the DUP, but peace made it respectable, because in a diplomatic and negotiating situation, they were the ones who were going to die in the last ditch for material or constitutional advantages for the Protestant community, basically. Great. So they are horribly a product of peace.
Right. Well, that's quite a fascinating and worrying issue, I think, that comes out of this.
Well, the same has happened on the Catholic side, of the Republican side, with Sinn Féin, who of course have become more moderate. The DUP have in many ways become more moderate in their view towards violence or whatever, but they certainly have become more moderate in their attitude to negotiations. They don't care what the world thinks of them. So if they are doing deals which
their social, community, economic,
if they're doing deals which perhaps by British standard look very dodgy, veering towards even corruption by British standards, they don't care. They're just, in fact, that's a badge of honour. It shows that they've actually succeeded in batting for their community.
Well, not quite a minute, Mark, slightly over, but I think a useful couple of pointers there, I think. So, given that it appears that the DUP is to some extent holding the British government hostage, where does this leave Brexit? Where does this leave the negotiations?
Well, logic suggests that, and again, this programme has no views on the subject whatsoever, it suggests that Mrs May made a terrible mistake, one of many, at the party conference last year, when she basically said, we're not going to be in the customs union, we're not going to be in the single market. The obvious thing to ensure uniformity between the Northern Ireland situation and the rest of the UK is to go for a soft Brexit, so that there wouldn't be, so we'd be still in the single market, still have the big part of the customs union, and so some of the intrusive nature of this border wouldn't be necessary, and that the only thing that would be really necessary, I guess, would be rigorous checks to make sure, in terms of immigration, basically movement of people rather than movement of of goods. That's a logical solution. However, the DUP are against continued membership of the European Union, and they would, I think, prefer the installation of a hard border than Britain capitulating and going back to the EU and saying it was all a mistake. Let's have a soft Brexit instead.
Okay. Well,
so I mean, for a start, I mean, we've got to the stage where the EU negotiators now realise that the chances are, if they precipitate Mrs May's downfall, that they'll get somebody worse. So they're actually now on a rescue Mrs May mission. And so, from the point of view, it may hilariously, because these things are so counterintuitive, it may actually strengthen Britain's hands in the negotiation, because it started off with the EU commissioners obviously feeling, and the negotiators feeling very, very estranged from Mrs May. Well, now they're thinking we've got to give her some kind of plausible deal. The trouble is that this particular thing, the Northern Ireland border, is one where if there's a compromise which satisfies the DUP, it won't satisfy Ireland, and Ireland has got a veto over the process. So I think it's just it's a calamity. It means either we're going to go for a soft Brexit, which is going to arouse all sorts of bitter feelings. The Conservative right wing will probably topple Mrs May, or do its best to topple Mrs May, or no deal.
Right.
I think that's where we are now. I think that probably hard Brexit is a lot less likely now than it was 3 days ago.
So what you think then, we are left with two options: a softer Brexit, and
or no
a
deal at all, which is kind of, I guess,
Yeah.
you would say, tantamount to being hard Brexit.
Yeah.
But it's kind of, in other words, I suppose the negotiating position put out by Mrs May
Sure.
at the conference, which is a deal. There would be a deal, but it would be a hard Brexit.
Right.
That's the thing that now seems to me to be pretty well gone, dead
Sure.
in the water.
Yeah, I think you're right on that. But as we're quickly running out of time, I wonder,
Yeah.
Mark, could you give us just a couple of things to look out for? So, what are the things that we need to look out for if we want to understand what's happening and the directions that we might be moving in, whether it's toward a soft
Right.
Brexit or a no deal?
Well, there's a summit meeting, I think on the 16th, where it was intended that the first phase of negotiations, which is tidying up all the preliminaries, that would be finished and then we move on to trade talks. I think that one way or another, these are very skilled people, and I think the DUP probably, now again, this is all speculating, this
Yeah.
programme has nothing to do with this, but not all of the Danegeld or ransom money that the DUP was promised as part of the deal, not all of that has yet been handed over. In fact, my understanding is not very much of it has. Well, I think the likely event is that a cheque will be forthcoming more quickly than it would otherwise have been, at which point the DUP will try to find a form of words which satisfies both sides. And as I say, the problem is what they really want is material goodies for their people at home, and some lifting of the threat that this is going to lead to a united Ireland. Now, the second one I think is a lot more tricky, but the first one, at any rate, they can say our stand has delivered the goods for you, the people of Northern Ireland. It'll increase their support and therefore make it probably less likely that there will be this drift towards a united Ireland. So, in other words, I think what we'll find is a weaselish compromise on the wording, in which the DUP will give a little bit in return for the acceleration of the package that they were promised by Mrs May. That's my guess. Otherwise it'll just be breakdown, because they won't have a deal before this summit meeting on the 16th of December.
Well, that sounds incredibly worrying.
Yes, it's all worrying, and all this. Mrs May obviously has been the target of a death threat. Really, events are moving horribly quickly, and there seems to be nobody in control anywhere. That's the point. There doesn't seem to be any sure hands on any of the levers of power, except perhaps for Mr Putin and the rulers of China.
Right, the one thing that strikes me, and I think we should probably leave the show very quickly after this point, for fear of having antagonised Mr Putin. And
no, I've just said a nice thing about him.
You did.
He's a rock of stability in a...
Indeed. In an ocean of something else.
Yeah, an ocean of not stable things that are watery and swishing around.
The thing that the Brexiteers were advocating, it seemed to me, was that they want to reclaim political control, to regain control, to purify the political system.
Good luck with that one.
But it seems that at this point, we are so far removed from a more purer form of democratic...
Oh, well, all that stuff. But to give them their due, they did think that there'd be a very turbulent period in the short term, but that there'd be sunny uplands in the, perhaps 5, 6, 7... however many years, that all of the turbulence is worthwhile, and they are causing turbulence, which obviously shows that they want the creative destruction in order to produce something better at the other end. The trouble is, I'm afraid, that this kind of thing does show it exposes the weakness of Britain if it's going to be an autonomous operator without other, it's falling out with America, although that will obviously remain, but on the surface that's very rocky. It's falling out with Russia, Mrs May, talking about cyber crime and all this kind of thing, and of course it's alienating the European Union. Exactly. So it's a challenging outlook.
Is very challenging, and I think that the thing that ties all of these issues that we've discussed today is that even if there is a peace that can be achieved, that peace isn't necessarily a positive one. It isn't necessarily something that will empower people and their agency and work for good and the betterment of humankind.
Yeah, well, again, when the Good Friday Agreement was signed, nobody expected that the DUP and Sinn Féin would be the beneficiaries of that. But equally, of course, the Scottish National Party has been the beneficiary of devolution north of the border. And, you know, all this can be connected with underlying uncertainty about what Britain is and its place in the world. And that uncertainty, or at least the delusions connected with that, although this programme has no views on Brexit, it's clear that distorted views of Britain's place in the world were at work in prompting a vote which has thrown all of these real practical problems into sharp relief. It's almost as if the Leavers were in a plot, first of all to expose Britain's reduced status in the world, but secondly to promote the breakup of the United Kingdom itself. You know, that's a conspiracy theory too far, but that's been the practical impact of the Brexit vote.
It has. And that's quite a theory that perhaps we need to explore in more detail in future episodes. But Mark, we're out of time. We've got no time to do Book of the Week. We've got no time to talk about tithes.
We haven't got a book for a Book of the Week.
Well, that's right.
How about this one? Is that good?
It's excellent.
There we are. Is it by Simon Mabon? No.
No, by chance it's not.
It's by chance. No, it isn't. Anyway, so it's done its job. I'll read it with interest because it looks very good.
You putting it back safely on a shelf, and I think the plant's in one piece.
Anything else to talk about? You wanted to talk about Yemen, but have we run out?
We're out of time.
Oh no, and Tide Times.
Tide Time. We're out of time.
John Stuart Mill news.
None.
No, I don't think there is any of that. So that's okay.
Right. So,
okay.
I guess we've been the Impact Narrative. Thank you for watching. As usual, do the things of tweeting, sharing, liking, sending mock comments about his stomach, subscribing.
It's been
below.
really well behaved today. I could sense that maybe afterwards.
Right.
But we have been and will continue to be the Impact Narrative.
Thanks for watching.